Elizabeth, nice job today out in the garden.
Oh, thank you.
It went well, I thought.
I'm glad. I'm glad you were on it, letting me know about sound. So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And anybody, if my sound goes out, please let me know. This headphone has been having some being ornery today. So
good morning.
All right. So it's 12 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Good noon. Good noon, everybody. Welcome to Reading Group today. I'm Elisabeth Palmer. I'm an educator at the museum, and today we are looking at our October book, which is Juan de Pareja. I can't see everybody, but how many people have read it? Have you finished reading it?
Yes.
I see a few hands and nods.
Yes.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Awesome.
I'm just here as an observer for my first session.
What was that?
I'm just here as an observer for my first session.
Perfect.
I'll start with the November book.
That's fine. I was just about to say, I think that's the most yes responses I've received during my books. Normally they're really thick. And they're not, they're enjoyable, but they're not as fun as this one. So welcome to Reading Group. Anybody else is new, welcome. And if you have any questions about it, everybody in this group would be happy to, answer them. And you can ask away in chat throughout. During the presentation, if you'll go ahead and mute yourselves, I will have some questions, and that will be a time if you have an answer. If you want to participate, you can unmute. That makes sense. And Brandy is going to keep an eye on questions for me and send them my way so I can answer them. So today we're reading this wonderful quick read, Juan de Pareja. If you haven't finished reading it, if you haven't picked it up yet, it is very enjoyable. As you can see, it's really quick. I read it in a day, and that was me going slow since I was preparing for a presentation. So this book is by Elisabeth Borton de Trevino, and this is her here. And she was born in Bakersfield, California, and she always wanted to become an author. And to do that, she started studying at Stanford University, and she graduated in 1925 with a bachelor's degree in Latin American history. And then about 10 years later, in 1935, she married Luis Jorge Trevino Herolia y Gomez Sanchez de la Barquera. Oh, that's a very long name. And moved to, thank you, Barbara, and moved to his hometown of Monterrey, Mexico. And they had two sons, Luis Federico and Enrique Ricardo Trevino Borton. And they were born in Monterrey. And then they moved to Mexico City about 6 years after they were married in 1941. Their final move was to Cuernavaca in Morelosin in 1965, known popularly as the City of Eternal Spring. And I'm very sorry, my Spanish is a little rusty. I haven't taken it since high school. So this was a lot of fun being thrown back into Spain and Spanish. Her book, which is what we are looking at today, won the Newbury Medal in 1966. And it was inspired by her elder son, Louis' interest in art, particularly painting. And he told her the story of the artist Diego Velázquez and his slave, Juan de Pareja, and who was a model for one of Velázquez's most famous paintings, who Velázquez instructed in painting and later freed. And after seeing the original Velázquez painting of Juan, she was inspired to write about their relationship, which she did here. Other novels that she's written are several memoirs of her life as an American who married into a traditional Mexican family. I think there are about 4 or 5 of those. So if you enjoyed her here and want to learn more about her life, plenty of reading material to go out, but she like a very interesting lady. So today, I thought we'd look at Juan. We look at a little bit of Velasquez since he is part of Juan's story, but we don't know a lot about Juan. And a lot of this is actually like, you know, her imagination piecing together what their relation could have been. Obviously, as an enslaved person, we don't have a lot of records outside of ownership, really. And then later free, it was still kind of not really a thing that was done. And Velasquez himself didn't keep a lot of records. He didn't write a lot. So we don't have a lot of first person records on him. But we know based on other accounts like the court of King Philip and others about his life. So because we don't know a lot about them, I thought it might be good to look at 3 artists who also started as enslaved peoples and who later became artists. So that's what we'll do today. And again, if you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them in the chat. So start with, who was Juan de Pareja? And here's what we know. We know that he was born in the early 17th century. We know his mother, Zulema, died when he was 5 years old. We know that Velasquez inherited Juan from relatives in Seville. We know that this painting here, this is Velasquez's portrait of Juan, was painted in Italy. And we know that Velasquez gave de Pareja his freedom and that he later went on to practice his own art. He did paintings as well. So that's what we know. It's not a lot outside of his paintings and those facts. But I wanted to take a moment here and look at this portrait with you all and just kind of talk about this for a moment. Talk about who Juan, you know, how Juan is portrayed. And many of Velasquez's portraits included symbolism and insight about the seated figure. So what can you tell about Juan's character by looking at his portrait? And someone can unmute themselves and just kind of give a one-worded answer, a sentence, whatever moves you.
Very noble fellow.
Very noble fellow. Excellent. What, anybody else?
He seems proud and
dignified.
and deliberate. I get that feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. So dignified, deliberate, proud. Any other thoughts?
Glad to be wearing that lovely lace collar.
Oh, yes, as they did.
I think because he's looking right at us so strongly, he looks very confident.
Yes, very confident. I mean, just the way he's holding himself, right? With the shoulders back and holding his head. It is very confident and bold.
His eyes also he looks reflective too. I mean, I wonder what he's thinking while he's being painted.
Yeah. And as we were reading, you know, the book, you know, Juan, you know, he observes that in a lot of Velasquez's painting, like this, you know, that moment of the person, like, what are they thinking? Who are they? You know, their personality of being confident and reflective, and, you know, just the way they hold themselves, I think he captures very nicely. And you can see that with, you know, this person who at this time is enslaved, which I think is, you know, just really interesting. This, you know, how he holds himself, how he's portrayed. And that leads me to my next question.
Can I answer the other question one more time?
Of course.
I think Ruth Gator Ginsburg would have liked his collar.
Yes. Yes. I think so. Yeah.
And you know, Elisabeth, you're alluding to Juan noticing Velasquez and how Velasquez finds a person and gets the intrinsic value of that person in the painting, in the portrait, which is fascinating because that's exactly what he's doing to Juan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was very well said, Liz. Thank you. And so that leads me, that leads me to my next question was, what does this painting tell us about the relationship between Velasquez and Juan? Does anyone want to try and tackle that?
Yes, yes.
I think it says they respected each other.
Absolutely. I get that vibe too. Anybody else?
I also feel that it shows that Juan de Pareja was a very special person in Velasquez's life. For him to spend the time and the energy to portray him in this beautiful way that shows really his character, his really good character and integrity.
I agree. Any others?
I'm thinking that Velasquez is showing Juan what he could become, because we don't know if he has been told he's going to be freed at the point of this portrait. But it may be, see what you could be, the way I'm painting you. And Juan almost looks as though he's looking in a mirror, proud and surprised, because surely he did not dress like that as a slave of a painter. He would be in bad clothes, mixing pigments and, you know, doing the hard work of running a studio.
Right.
So I'm thinking he's seeing something that is a possibility for himself now, thanks to Velasquez.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good possibility, and I think as well. And right now, time-wise, Velasquez is a painter of King Philip's court, and so I think he may have put him in these clothes as someone who is attached to the court as a respected member, which is really big too, like really big, right? An enslaved person being well presented in these fine clothes, not just in person, but also in a painting, is huge. It's monumental, especially when you look at how others who are enslaved or outcast in society are portrayed. And I think Velasquez being that person who painted what was in front of him, what he was seeing, I think that's really important. We see that in his other paintings, as well as his other portraits, not just.
But you know, Elizabeth, Penny's comment, Velasquez was foretelling. He was. I think Penny's comment was wonderful. He's foretelling one's future.
Mm-hmm.
It's fabulous.
Yeah.
And also what I want to add to Penny's is.
Oh, Barbara, we lost you. You're muted.
Oh, I want to add to Penny's comment that what we also see is what Juan de Pareja is becoming. He sees that fulfillment in him, and how noble he accepts that. Almost a nobility about him.
Those are all great comments. Thank you.
I don't want to be a bad guy over here, but
That's okay, Amy. Do it.
Go for it.
A lot of the assumptions that are being made are kind of romanticizing slavery, and I know that's probably not the intent, but keep in mind, like, we don't know how Velasquez treated his slave. We don't know. So
Right.
you all are seeing a lot of confidence, and I do see that in the posture, but it's much easier to posture someone in a confident manner. But I'm seeing a lot of nervousness in the eyes. I don't think Juan was comfortable sitting there, but you know, when the person who owns you says, I need someone to sit this portrait so that I can get this technique done, you sit there. And you know, artists use what's available. So I do want to like kind of caution. I know this was a real feel-good story, and it did gloss over the fact that Juan was owned by another human being. So please keep in mind he was still a slave.
And Amy, you are, I think appreciate your comments, and I had those same thoughts while reading the book, because it did seem very romanticized in the book, and I had a hard time believing, personally, I don't know if anyone else felt this way, like believing that he was okay and fine with being a slave. And one of my questions for the reading group, but I don't know if anyone, had a chance to answer those questions, but, these different perspectives on slavery, how Juan seems to be accepting and Lolis is not. So again, and we don't know much about their relationship. We can only tell from the painting and, the fact that he was later freed, which says something in itself, I think. Not sure why, but we do know that he was eventually freed when he didn't have to be. But I'll get to that question. You guys just think about that in there. So I wanted to, for those that don't know Velasquez as well, here is his self-portrait here. There he is. And he was born in Seville, Spain, in 1599. At the age of 12, he became an apprentice to Francisco Pecchio, and he's known for working heavily in dark and light contrast and portraying his subjects very realistically. And although his early paintings were religious themed, as most artists at the time were, right? He became renowned for his realistic and complex portrait as a member of King Philip IV's court, and his later years of producing the portrait of, this portrait of Pope Innocent X. And then the painting that we all, most people know, which is Las Meninas, which is where that detail of his self-portrait comes in. And this, we could have a whole discussion about this painting and how complex it is, and the mind trickery that happens in here. And the fact that these are real paintings on the wall, art historians have identified them. So, he was very realistic. And we have here a scene where, the princess is, looking at us, the viewer, or possibly the king and the queen, as we see in this like very strange mirror portrait thing. Is it a mirror? Is it a portrait? We don't know. But it is well lit, and that it makes us think it could be a portrait. But it's very complex, and it tricks you. So she's looking at us. He's looking at us too. So are we the subject? Are we being painted? That's a lot of fun. So this has captured the imagination and minds of art historians for years. Decades. So it's a lot of fun. And I would say this is probably his most well-known painting here. And I just wanted to include them as we look at two paintings that I found by Juan. The first being The Flight into Egypt that he painted in 1658, which is an oil on canvas. And this is at the Ringling Museum of Art. So anyone who...
Sarasota. Yeah, it's just Sarasota.
Yes, in Sarasota. So if you've been down there and you've seen this painting and you weren't sure who Juan de Pareja was, now you know.
Yeah.
You got to,
It's so much lighter.
It is lighter, but you still have those heavy contrasts of those light and dark shadows, and I guess a different treatment of the figures with the lighting, and then of course it being a religious subject as well. So we see that it is much lighter, and I think more similar to his earlier paintings. And then here's another one that I found of The Calling of St. Matthew.
Oh, that's
from 16. Yeah, I mean the colors are so vibrant, and you can really get the shading of the robes on Christ, and even the patterning, the textile of the tablecloth here. The lace on this gentleman is also very exquisite, and look, look who's over here. You recognize that?
Yeah, I believe so.
I think, whether it was intentional or not, just through his experiences, he was exposed to Velasquez and the artists that came to visit Velasquez and the artists that they were visiting while they were in Italy. They are seeing those masters and those artists and how they're working. So the composition is quite similar, I think, to Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, just reversed a little bit, I think, with the window, Christ here, but it's just brighter. It's much brighter than Caravaggio and Velasquez. And he does include himself in here, almost in the same way as Velasquez's portrait, which I think is very interesting. And so that brings us to, just kind of to talk about the book, which is a quick read, and, written in the 60s. And what we know now is much, we know much more. We're more aware. So here is another cover that was published with the book. And I do want to go back to, some of these ideas like slavery, the views of slavery, and why do you think the author presented those different viewpoints? Does anybody want to try and tackle that?
I would, this is just, okay, maybe romanticizing, but if Velasquez, well, first of all, Juan was so happy to have a place to sleep and some food to eat. So I think, obviously no one wants to be a slave, but I think he was thankful for his position. But I have a feeling that Velasquez and Juan had a special relationship. And maybe he was looking at him more as his son. And it's true that Juan was not allowed to paint until he was freed. But I just kept thinking it was a different relationship than the usual master-slave. And especially because Velasquez was so dependent on Juan for grinding the paint just right, mixing the paint just right, just a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and the paint color is messed up. So Velasquez depended on Juan for what Velasquez was doing too. So I think there was an interesting dependency there upon each other.
Yeah, that we see in the book. Yeah. Anybody else? And it's okay if you don't. It is it is a very heavy subject, especially with two different viewpoints. But while I was saying earlier with Amy, is that I couldn't get it out of my head, especially with the introduction of Lolis, this juxtaposition of viewpoints.
I liked the different viewpoints. I thought that Lois's viewpoint, we all have different viewpoints. We all come to our thinking from the experiences that we have and how we were raised and so many different things. And for me, I liked that they had two polar viewpoints, because we don't all think alike. We don't all have the same perceptions. And so I think it's realistic that they could both be slaves and both think differently about being a slave.
Or maybe the circumstances they had been put in. I think if anyone's being romanticized, it's Velasquez, especially when we're thinking about the painting, that we're thinking of him as already seeing equality and freedom at the time he paints that for this man. And again, it's very tempting to look at everything through our lens, and we have no idea, as Elisabeth has said. We have no idea if that was a comfortable sitting, as Amy has said. We do know that he seems to be painted as a gentleman. Everyone felt that way, that he seemed to be painted as very confident, as almost more important than Velasquez painted himself sometimes. Though he's pretty important in that last Meninas you were showing us. And so I don't know, I wonder if what we're really romanticizing is the artist's views on justice that we just don't know. Although we do know that eventually an enslaved man was liberated and an enslaved man had learned to be an artist from this artist, which gives us some sense of what his views were at the time he painted that. But and as you said, Elizabeth, we think about this written in the 60s with these two views of someone being more accepting and someone being more defiant of an unjust system. I think it's just a really good question you've posed. And even if it's seen from a lens 50, 60 years later, it's this dialogue about the system and about people's respective positions in it. But like you say, it's a little cringy when you read it.
Yeah, yeah. And with these questions, especially those who are new, I'm not expecting any right answers. This is totally what you're thinking, or maybe you need more time to think about it. But so I think, Alex, to your point of romanticizing the artist, I think we are doing that since we, again, don't know very much, and we can only kind of make our own connections from the two facts that we know, which is how he painted the subject and that he later freed that subject.
I also think that the artist chose to take a very kinder and gentler approach to her characters, because she does paint them in a certain way that leans more toward justice and understanding. And I can't get into Velasquez's mind, but from the author's point of view, he seems to be a very cerebral person who thinks things through, to the nth degree before he does anything, or even before he speaks, which is not a lot. There's more emotion in his painting, if you can call it emotion, where he picks up the character and internalizes from there with his own form of reality. But it's nice to know that there were people, I'd like to think, that really treated others as they would want to be treated, even their slaves, to a certain degree. Even though I'm romanticizing that, I do think there were people that had that kinder, gentler view of others.
And Elisabeth, I think, even, as Alice pointed out, it was through a 60s lens that we're looking at this. It won the Newbury Medal, which is actually literature for children. And I wonder how deep she really meant to get into the problems of racism, and whether she just felt like, I don't know if she wrote this book with the intention of it being a children's literature book or not, but if she did, she probably didn't want to get into a lot of the harder issues, and she could just present two issues and tell her story, and that would be enough.
Yeah, Frank, I as a teacher, I totally agree with you, because I saw it as a fictional biographical sketch of Velasquez.
Yeah, and I like that that take, Frank, because I do think it's easier for some to get into a young adult novel and be introduced to these people and the themes that are in it, like slavery, even free will versus destiny, talking about that. Oops, sorry. And, the idea of truth, because that comes out a lot in the novel. What does it mean to have artistic truth? What does it mean to be truthful with oneself, being truthful to others, right? That frequently came up, and I thought that was also interesting, as well as fate and free will. Did anybody else have any thoughts on those themes repeatedly coming up before we move on? This has been a great discussion.
On page 161, the wife of Juan talks about hating being a slave, resenting being a slave. It says, I could not feel grateful in my heart, for deep inside I resented being bound. She says, I hated being owned. It was all I could do some days to keep the hot words inside my mouth and the resentment out of my voice. Never mind, everything is different now, and if we have children, they will be born free. So it did bring up good conversation for young adults to talk about slavery and the fact that you don't always have a good master.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess your environment can, you know.
Now, whether or not that really went on, I don't know. You know, this is the author's imagination, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and I think to that point, you know, it dawned on me, you know, this is still, I mean, written in the 60s, but it's still very relevant today, and we still are fighting these romanticized ideas of, you know, that people have about slavery. And so I think, you know, that this is still a good read for young adults, and Lolis's view on her experience is very, very important.
I think too, Elizabeth, that it might have been easier for this author to write a book about slavery in the 1960s if she said it in another country, in another time. Because some of the children reading this book may well have had very strong negative feelings about their children reading a book about slavery. We're only 6 years past Brown v. Board in 1960. But if you can set this in Spain and make it both characters sympathetic, all three characters, Lolis and Juan and Velasquez, then I think you get your point across in a less threatening way. Maybe that was part of her thinking.
That's a good possibility. Thank you, Mary Lou.
That's great.
All right. Any final thoughts before we go into the three artists? And these are American artists that I found that were enslaved and later became artists. Okay.
And now, just following on Mary Lowell's point, I think it was written in 1965. If I'm not mistaken. So we're living through Civil Rights Act of 1964 and working towards, who knows at what point, the Voting Rights Act in that year. But yeah, as you said, thinking about the battles for justice that are being played out on American shores and in Alabama at that time, using, and such an unlikely story, right? It's not the art history story for teens we might expect.
That's so true.
And it hadn't been, we haven't come across another book about Juan de Pareja in our searching. So we did this one. There may be plenty out there, Elizabeth, you may have, but it is very interesting to think about where we were in terms of battles for justice. And, you know, if she imagined a character that may not be believable to us, yes, what was that character a foil? Was it meant to say something more about his future than his present, that he felt this way? They're all just very interesting questions.
And yeah, thank you, Alice. So, I mean, it's a wonderful book. It's very complex, and it really makes you think, especially with the 21st century mind that we have. And that kind of brings me to, go on, there we go, enslaved artist. And so we've moved away as a culture from saying, you know, this was a slave to enslaved. And some of you, I don't know if you've heard this difference, the shift of language, but we have started to use that more as a way of affirming that slavery was forced upon that person rather an inherent condition. So that's why I'm using that language. I'll be using that language to talk about these three other artists. And I did also with that want to put into context of what's happening in the book before we get into the story that we know pretty well in our country. which is in the in the 1600s, slavery was very commonplace in Spain. In 1517, Spain began to import enslaved Africans. And it wasn't until 1871 where they formally abolished slavery in their American colonies. If you think about all the territories that Spain had in the Americas, including Mexico too, because there is an American living in Mexico in a traditional Mexican family. So she's also, I think, hearing that side as well. And there were also enslaved Turks and Moors. And so that's 1871. And we know that in 1865, we had the American Civil War. So that's also happening at the time. And with the broader issue of slavery is the African and Arabian Peninsula had slavery into the 1900s, with Mauritania in Northwest Africa becoming the last nation to abolish slavery in 1980. Wow. That is so, what? Just thinking about it, that's still so present that, that trauma, that experience is still very much alive around the world. So, just thinking about that, I know when we talk about history, things just seem so far removed, but that's still a lived experience, and people are still working through that, and those conversations still need to be had. And so at the beginning, I did say that while I was reading the novel, I wanted to learn about other enslaved peoples who became artists, because there's no way Juan was the only one, right? So, but knowing that not all of their stories were recorded, so it's impossible. It's not always possible to find all of the information that we want to know. Just like Juan's story is very bare, itself. That I do task you at the end of this presentation, just to, research artists, who were enslaved and who became artists, because their stories need to be told. And I think they add something to our country, but and globally as well, other countries and their cultures and their arts. So that's your homework that I'll leave you to. I won't check in to see if you actually did it, but I'll just trust you. Honor code. And so the three, and I'll give you three to start with, and then you can go off and do it yourself. So the first one that I found was Joshua Johnson, and he was an active painter in Maryland in Maryland and Virginia from roughly the 1790s to 1825. And he was born into slavery in mid-18th century Maryland to a white man and a black slave woman owned by William Wheeler Sr. Chattel records note his race as mulatto. And though Maryland had no legal definition of what constituted black versus mixed race at the time. So it's interesting, just data-wise. There was an art historian, J. Hall Pleasance, who located documents variously describing Johnson as a slave trained as a blacksmith, a black servant and afflicted with consumption, and an immigrant from West Indies. And I tell you that just to show how complex researching these figures are, how hard it can be based on records. So you really have to, historians for the most part have gone through these records and tried to piece these threads together. But we did narrow it down, and we did learn that he earned his freedom in 1782 after completing an internship with a Baltimore blacksmith named William Forepaugh. This was not unprecedented. In the 18th century, a small number of enslaved and free Africans worked as apprentices to white artisans. Before 1760, however, most trained craftsmen were either carpenters or cask repairmen, so a little shift. By the 1770s, they were engaged in a number of trades, including shoemaking, blacksmithing, and tailoring. During his time as a blacksmith, Johnson learned how to construct canvases and source painting materials. According to property records, he moved often, and he primarily lived in a section of Baltimore that was popular with furniture decorators, which suggests that he may have supplemented his income by painting furniture. So Baltimore at the time was an excellent place for him to take up portraiture, given its relatively open-minded attitude, relatively being the key word there, people, towards free Blacks. In the 18th and 19th century, the city featured one of the largest African-American populations in the US. White workers seeking apprentices in Baltimore tended to ignore the Maryland laws that prohibited them from teaching trade, reading, and writing skills to free Africans. And Johnson was able to advance his artisanship here, becoming listed in city directories as a limner or portrait painter. So quite an accomplishment. In newspapers, he advertised himself as a self-taught genius, deriving from nature and industry his knowledge of the art, who had experienced many obstacles in the pursuit of his study. Johnson's portraits bear striking resemblance to those of Charles Willson Peale, Charles Peale Polk, and Rembrandt Peale himself, who were all members of a family of artists who worked on the East Coast. The similarities in poses, costumes, and technique have led some art historians to insist that Johnson's association with the Peales may have existed, but others claim these elements have been greatly exaggerated since Johnson never apprenticed with the family. So there's a lot of discussion in the art history world about it. Not everyone agrees. So keep an open mind and do your research. Not just one, but like several. That's my lesson. That's it. So here are some examples of his work. This one here on the left is the portrait of Mrs. Barbara Baker Murphy. She was the wife of the sea captain. And you can find this at the Smithsonian American Art Museum here. And then this one by him is a portrait of the Westwood children and their dog. And this is at the National Gallery of Art. So you can kind of see these similarities to Peale. They're very reminiscent of early American portraiture, especially self-taught. But they're quite lovely. Any questions on Johnson before we move to our second artist? Okay, all right. Here we are going to get into the Peale family. So that's my little connection there. So this is Moses Williams, and he's a silhouettist. And he was born in 1777. Lots of sevens, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Scarborough and Lucy Peale, who were slaves in the home of renowned artist and museum owner Charles Willson Peale. We have a Peale portrait in our collection, and there is evidence that Peale continued to accept slaves as payment for artworks or drawing lessons. So want to throw that out there, that while we do appreciate his art, this was his practice as a working artist. It is believed that Williams's parents began to work for Peale sometime between 1769 and 1775. They were later freed by the Pennsylvania's Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, a law passed in 1780, requiring enslaved people to be freed at the age of 28. Thus, leaving 11-year-old Williams to grow up in Peale's home amongst the artist's 17 children, including Rembrandt Peale, who would go on to become a portraitist himself, Raphael Peale, Franklin Peale, Tish and Ramsey Peale. And Williams' father, Scarborough, changed his name to John Williams, passing along his new last name to his son. Growing up in the Peale household, Williams was instructed in skills that would help him to work at the Peale's museum, including taxidermy, object display, and silhouette making. As a slave, he was not taught the higher art of painting. After showing his skill at silhouette making, Williams was given a physionotrace by Peale, the physiotrace machine by Peale to make silhouettes. And he continued to work at the Peale's museum as a freed man. He was freed by Peale at the age of 27, a year before the legal requirement. And he became a professional silhouettist, making black and white paper silhouettes for visitors of the museum. He also created silhouettes of the Peale family, including Charles Wilson Peale and his wife, Elisabeth. And so down here on his portrait, we can see his name here. And then cutter of, can't make out the writing, but this is attributed to Raphael Peale. Maybe it's cutter of profiles. I think that's what that must say, cutter of profiles. It's cut off on my screen. So. All right, so here's some other examples that he did. Did someone have a comment? Okay, these two, the left is Angelica Peale Robinson, and here on the right is Charles Wilson Peale. And during this time, Williams would offer silhouettes for just 8 cents to visitors. And he did this as early as 1802, which is what we have a record of. He may have done it earlier, but we're not sure. He produced thousands. He made over 8,000 silhouettes during his first year working at Peale's museum. That's a large number. And then, that was just his first year. So you can imagine over the following 2 decades to when he was, freed, and then his own professional life, how many he created, but we just don't have the right number. He stood out quickly, and it became an attraction. And that boosted the museum attendance. Many visitors came to see his work first and Peale's artwork second. And we do have some writings, letters about that. So that's pretty big. With that money, Williams earned that he earned making silhouettes. He was able to buy his own home, and he was able to marry. By 1820, he started experiencing silhouette cutting as a profession declining, and he had to sell his home. And according to a novel about him called The Poison Place, he was listed in city directories as a profile cutter until 1833. And it was around that time where he did have to, sell his home, and he stopped professionally. His silhouettes can be found in a number of institutions, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. And today, silhouettes have they're re-emerging as an art form, especially in the works of contemporary African-American artists like Kara Walker, who subverts the medium to depict the realities of slavery and racial stereotypes. So silhouettes are something that you've enjoyed. If you want a contemporary take, I definitely recommend you looking into her work because it is quite stunning. So any questions about Moses Williams? Okay. And finally, to take us home, our very own Bill Traylor.
Oh, yeah.
I could not could not include him. So he's a painter, and he was born into an enslaved family in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1854, before the Civil War. He spent most of his life in the rural southern plantation world of farming, staying on as a paid worker after emancipation. And the very name Trailer is taken from the family who owned land, just like Williams. His parents' original names were Peel. Same thing here. In the 1920s, he left the agricultural life and moved toward the state capital of Montgomery. And only in the last decades of his life, when Trailer was in his 80s and living in extremely difficult circumstances on the street of the Black Business District, did the artist begin steadily producing drawings and paintings for which he is now celebrated. These works are often on cardboard, paper, and so the survival of these fragile works is the most remarkable element, I think, of Trailer's complex backstory. How many were made is unknown, since they were so fragile, and that any are preserved, is often a thanks to a chance meeting with the artist Charles Shannon, who was a young art student from Montgomery who saw Trailer at work on his drawings in 1939, and recognized Trailer's talents and abilities, and appreciated his style, which is very different than others. And so he encouraged Shannon encouraged Trailer, supplied him with materials, and saved the artworks from saved what he could. And after mounting exhibitions in Trailer's lifetime, Shannon and his wife continued to store the drawings until the time came for them to be appreciated. And I was on a program yesterday with MoMA. It's called Art and Sight, and they talked about Bill Trailer. And apparently, Trailer's work was offered to MoMA in the 40s, 50s. And they didn't take it. And they're just like, not for us. No. And it wasn't until the 80s when Trailer had a breakthrough show at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., an exhibition titled Black Folk Art in America, 1930 to 1980. Featured 3 dozen of his works that he was starting to get recognized, and museums kind of kicked themselves as they were offered it earlier. They're like, oh man, should have got on that sooner. But galleries and curators were starting to value his work. The catalog, if you're interested, is still available for that exhibit. And Trailer's art has been included in almost every exhibition of self-taught art, if not all of them, since then, which is very impressive. By 2013, Trailer was called one of the finest American artists of the 20th century. And collectors, dealers, auction houses became involved. Individual paintings and drawings today bring 5 to 6 figure prices. So really big deal. We even had, not us, but the Smith Gallery of, Sam, right? Okay, thank you, Alice. The American Art Museum had recently a retrospective of Bill Trailer's work. I think last year. What is time anymore? Last year, right, Alice? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that catalog is also still available, and we worked closely with Sam to, especially with the catalog. One of our works is on the cover of the catalog book, and we at the museum have 30 works of art by Trailer. So it's quite impressive, and you can check those. You can see all of those on our collection website. But I do have 2 examples here. This one being Woman with Bird, and then this other one being called House. Mm-hmm. And it is important, while we were looking at his work yesterday with MoMA, Some of the titles are interesting, and they made a good note that, you know, not to take the titles as like artists given. Sometimes titles are given afterwards, after they've been brought into a collection. So keeping that in mind. But we see, like, you know, this, you know, just a really wonderful depiction of, you know, the woman here with her bright colored, you know, sleeveless turtleneck shirt and this wonderfully patterned skirt, which is so much fun.
What is this?
And then holding the bird here. And then even, you know, this blue house with dog down here, and even people working on the house in different positions. So, and you can see too, I think, you know, the irregularity of the material that he used along the edges. You see in this top right corner of house that it's torn. And then other places where he uses cardboard, you see like the seams where the cardboard has been folded. And I wish too, like we had photos, because it was really interesting with MoMA that they were able to take photos of the back of the drawings, and you could see, you know, that he used old candy boxes, he used old posters, and that also gives, you know, not only is his work a wonderful glimpse of the time and his experience, but, you know, to see on the back, like the material view of, you know, that what we were doing. Because I think one of them was a candy box of like he did use a Babe Ruth box, which was funny, but there was another one from like a candy company that I don't know it, but it was based in Chicago, but it had Charles Shannon's name. So I guess it was an order that Charles Shannon did, and then Shannon gave him the supply, you know, gave that to work on. So that's really cool, and that adds a nice little layer of understanding with there. So we have 4 minutes. So those are the 3 artists that, you know, if you didn't know Traylor was enslaved before becoming an artist, you know, that's a good learning. But also if you hadn't heard of Joshua Johnson and Moses Williams, I hope you've enjoyed their stories, and, you know, next time you're out at museums, when we can do that again fully, that when you see their names, you know who they are, and you can you know their story. So that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions, comments?
Thank you very much for doing it, honey.
You're welcome. It was enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was fantastic, Elizabeth, always. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys were wonderful. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. Always enjoy these.
A lot. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Always informative.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And don't forget your homework. That's the teacher coming out of me.
Forgotten it.
Yeah, research. Go research. Find some stories. Get those stories told. Share them with your friends and families. Share them on social media. Get those artists told. Yes.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a wonderful week.
Bye. Goodbye.
Okay, lead.